Edition of the FutureSox RoundUp. My name is Elijah Evans, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host Jeff Cohen. It's been a while, Jeff. We have a bit of hiatus. I was in Europe for 2 weeks. I'm trying to settle back into life. Jeff was enjoying some playoff baseball, taking some trips. We've been off the clock for a little bit here in terms of White Sox. Talking White Sox, doing all this stuff, talking about prospects, but in the time we have not talked, Jeff, one team in the White Sox organization made it all the way to the championship and lost in the final game of the Single-A Carolina League Championship, and another team in Birmingham won the Southern League AA Championship. So, pretty incredible stuff. We've talked about it, texting, and I've been trying to get online a little bit, even though I've been busy. But it's a really true testament to where the White Sox farm system is at right now and the growth that we've seen in the past year or two, that we had two teams that were within a game of a championship and one that won one, right? And that's, two teams also that started with completely different rosters than what they finished with. So it's really exciting stuff. We're going to kind of take it in multiple steps. We've got a few episodes to really catch up on here. So today's episode for everyone is going to be, reviewing a little bit of the guys in Chicago going on right now, but primarily we're going to focus on the Kannapolis Cannonballers run to the championship game in the Carolina League, and just kind of how that season went for that entire Single-A affiliate that had such an impressive season from start to finish, with so many different changes in the roster and just players up and down that team that have been impressive. And then next week, we're going to be joined by Kurt Bloom, broadcaster of the Barons, who has been on a few times with us, and we love talking to Kurt. And he is going to talk about the championship in Birmingham. Also next week, I am going to welcome on a few players from that Birmingham squad over the course of next week, and talk to them about, their championship experience, their season. So really excited to get to hear directly from some of those guys that just won a AA championship this past week. So first of all, Jeff, how are you doing before we dive into all this?
Doing great, Elijah. It's nice to have you back. Man, is there a lot of ground to cover since you were in Europe? But you make one interesting point that the two teams that went to the championship suggest just how much depth there is in the system now. And I'll point out that it was both Birmingham and Kannapolis got to the championship because they had excellent first halves of the season. And the teams that led the first half in Birmingham and Kannapolis, well, the one that was so dominant in Kannapolis is now in Winston-Salem. The one that was so dominant in Birmingham in the first half of the season is now either in Chicago or Charlotte. So that really speaks to the depth.
Yeah, 100%. You see it throughout the entire organization right now. It's impressive that, we've got a different looking system than we have in a while, right? And it's guys up and down, right? It shows the layers that there was able to, Birmingham, right, has such a great start with this starting rotation that's, now going to be the future rotation for the White Sox. But then they're able to bring in an entire new crop of players essentially throughout the second half of the season. And they struggled a lot in the middle of the season when they were transitioning from one roster to the next, essentially. But then these guys get comfortable. You add a few more pieces from Winston, and they just meshed and they gelled and they made it all the way and won this freaking Southern League. I mean, that's impressive too. It's a really competitive league, and there's some really good teams in that league. I mean, Montgomery is no joke. They've been strong all season. I mean, the Rays organization, as we know, is phenomenal, right? And it's big time. So it's really cool to see, just for everybody in the organization, all these prospects that we've talked to over the the past few years, right? Like it's really cool to see them just happy and excited, and it's also cool for the White Sox to to have a lot of hope in the farm system right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we get started though with a quick run through the major league team and who did well.
Yeah, we'll start in Chicago for now. This is the guy who we were talking about it, and we saw him in Charlotte. And I remember when we were in Charlotte together, I was like, this guy needs to get some innings in Chicago. Like the stuff is ticking up in a place that we haven't even seen it before. Sean Burke looks like a very clear rotation piece for the Chicago White Sox, and that is exciting. I'm fired up for him. I think it's really cool to see just what he was at. I mean, he looked excellent this past week against the Padres. He's set to start I think it's either today or tomorrow that he'll be starting against Detroit. And then I think it's tomorrow he'll be starting against Detroit. So for his last start of the season, he's going to finish the year with 4 major league starts, or four major league appearances. One of his first one was out of the bullpen, but this guy looks like a big league arm, Jeff. It's been really impressive stuff from Burke. In 14 innings pitched now in 3 outings, he's given up only 10 hits, only 4 walks for a guy that, had a lot of command issues at times earlier in the year, but has really found his groove. 16 strikeouts in those 14 innings for Burke so far. Is he like solidified in the rotation in your mind?
Well, he's solidified as an option going into spring training next year. And if he doesn't make the rotation out of spring training, assuming he's healthy, I could see him in Charlotte being, first man up, something like that. But the great thing about Burke, you and I both have talked to him. You and I both know what a really great guy he is. And it's like the Davis Martin story. It's a guy who was pitching well, and then got hurt and has come all the way back. And guys don't always make it all the way back. So it's good to see both those guys doing really well right now.
Yeah, 100%. It's great to see how far they've come. I mean, Martin's another guy that is going to be in the picture for the rotation, right? These are two pitchers, right? That like you talk about the future options, and we think about and consider the rotation, right? And immediately we think of Hagen Smith, Noah Schultz, obviously, right? Like that's the clear crop, right? And then Jonathan Cannon's established himself this year. Drew Thorpe, right, is going to be back. Jairo Uriarte, right? All these top arms. Grant Taylor, even, right? Sean Burke and Davis Martin are guys that don't come to mind immediately. And earlier this season, it was like, oh, it'd be nice if we can get these guys back. They both, Burke had a huge 2022, hurt all of last year. Davis Martin debuted in 2022, looked like he was something that went under surgery, right? They both kind of had washed 2023s, right? And they come into this year and it's like they're working their way back. It'd be nice if you can get something out of them, but there was no expectation necessarily that they were going to be key pieces. And now you've got two more arms that are going to be on this team. I think both of them, I think with Burke, right? Like I think Burke has proven that he can be a starter. I mean, he has shown no reason he shouldn't be, frankly, so far in these last few starts. At the same time, I think he could also be a great reliever if he ended up moving to that role eventually, like we've talked about before, right? So it's like you've got a big league arm. At the very least, you've got a big league arm. I frankly think he's going to stick as a starter the way he's been pitching the last few starts, and he looks like the best version of himself recently, which is awesome to see for a guy that had basically lost all 2023, was working his way back this year. It definitely had some ups and downs in Charlotte. But he looks great, and I think he's proven to be a big league arm. I think Martin's the same way. I think both those guys are going to be major league roster guys in 2025, regardless of what their role is.
Yeah, worst case, if Sean Burke's floor is that of a multi-inning reliever, some guy to pitch
And a really good one.
the seventh, yeah, he'll be a really good one. But you're right. I think he's got a rotation spot in next year, and it's his to lose in spring training.
Yeah. Honestly, I agree. And then, another guy in Cannon, Jonathan Cannon, right? I think that's another guy who is probably a little bit more like you don't see necessarily the upside we've seen from a Burke when it comes to Cannon, right? But he's been steady. He's been steady all season. He's been a solid pitcher. And that's something that, it's been up and down, right? It hasn't been great. But at the same time, like he's up to what, 22 appearances in Chicago this season now and 20 starts with a 4.3 ERA.
Wow.
Soft contact, it's 88 strikeouts, 37 walks, right? Like it's not, you're not getting a star out of Jonathan Cannon. And we know that with his profile, we saw him develop, right? And it doesn't look like a guy who's going to dominate lineups, but like if your 5 starter is going to give you a 4.3 ERA with a ton of soft contact every fifth day, right? Like I feel pretty good about that. And I think Cannon's proven that he's, going to push for a rotation spot, probably has a rotation spot going into next year. And if he really kind of regresses a little bit from where he's at right now, which I don't really think he will, but if he somehow regresses from where he's at, I think you could look at him as like the perfect long relief guy where you can let him go 4 innings on a day where a starter struggles, right?
Right. And, you mentioned that Burke is starting Saturday. Cannon is scheduled to start the last game of the season. And, wow, 20 starts. I didn't realize that was that many.
Creeps up on you, yeah.
I mean, he's got nice stats. It's really a nice sample of work and
100%.
Yeah, good return.
Yeah, I mean, it's the one guy who like I think it doesn't, it goes under the radar, right? I think he's definitely a guy that sneaks under the radar in general, but he looks like a piece, right? He looks like a legit piece, and this is 3 guys, right? We just mentioned 3 pitchers. There's a lot of pitchers for people that have been listening to us all year, like where we keep talking about this, but like they don't need to do much in terms of the pitching this offseason. They really don't. And I think that's something that, as bad as this team has been, I get the frustration, but like the pitching is not the issue. And the pitching is going to keep getting better when you've got guys like Mason Adams on the way and you've got, Drew Thorpe coming back and you've got Noah Schultz and Hagen Smith both on the way. Like there is some serious pitching talent. I mean, shout out Noah Schultz, also Double-A pitcher of the year that just got named, or the Southern League pitcher of the year. So that was, there's some pieces for sure. Staying in Chicago for a little bit before we move down the line, the bullpen in Chicago has been really not that bad lately, Jeff. It hasn't been that bad recently, and because of a few guys that should have been there for a while, right? Like it should have been there for a bit. Fraser Ellard is the first one I want to mention. Fraser Ellard has been really solid. The ERA has jumped up a little bit because he had a game recently that he got hit around a little bit. He gave up 2 runs on earlier this past week. But before that, Jeff, Fraser Ellard, before this 2-run outing the other day, had given up a total of 1 earned run in the month of September, prior to, the game the other day where he gave up 2. So this is a guy who, 3 total earned runs allowed in September. has been consistently steady after his first debut. Like, he had got thrown into a weird situation in his debut where he struggled his first 2 games or so, or his first game, right? And then since then, it's just been consistently really, really solid. Frazier Elliott is a piece and has earned a spot in this bullpen going forward.
Yeah, yeah. And as we talked about last week, we're starting to get a much clearer picture of what the bullpen next year is going
100%.
to look like. So hopefully, the White Sox will recognize there's no need to run out and sign Dominic Leone and John Brebbia, and that there are a lot of good pieces. We
Yeah.
haven't. There's a lot of guys that we're going to talk about who are
And
going to be options for that pen.
right. And because you're a rebuilding team and they know next year, you have to try and sign at least 1 or 2 veterans to try and flip them at the deadline for value. But like, at least allow the majority of the bullpen to be these young guys, because there's so many guys. Prelander Baroa is another one I want to mention. Prelander Baroa is a guy that, it's inconsistent at him for times, but he, was up and down, got shuffled back and forth, pitched 1 game, kind of filling holes for the White Sox earlier in the season. Once they just let him loose and let him be, a actual bullpen piece for the White Sox, looks pretty good, Jeff. He looks solid. He's been really steady. His last, his last 15 games, he got a 3.1 ERA. His last 7 games, he has a 2 ERA. It's been good for Baroa. This is a guy who, is a flamethrower. He's got good stuff. Now he's made 15 appearances at this point with, 17 innings with 26 strikeouts for Baroa. That's a bullpen piece. Another one that I think has kind of earned a spot going into 2025.
Yeah, and that's been a pleasant surprise because it didn't
Yeah.
look like that was going to pan out for much of the year. So
Yeah.
congratulations to him. Congratulations to Ethan Katz, whoever it was, Brian Bannister, whoever got him
Right.
turned around. Yeah, he looks like a much improved player now.
Yeah, I mean, in September for Baroa, and this is including giving up 2 runs. I mean, he just gave up his first 2 runs of the month this week. He has a 1.35 ERA in September, and didn't give up a single run until this past week in September. That's a piece for sure. And it's, this is a little bit of credit to Chris Getz's move here. This is one of his early moves with the White Sox was, the Gregory Santos deal. He got Gregory Santos turned into, second round comp pick Blake Larson, who is a high level pitching prospect, in addition to Baroa, and then Zach DeLoach, who hasn't done a ton with the White Sox so far, but was looking really good in Charlotte down the stretch here. So, and Gregory Santos has barely pitched this year and has been in and on and off the IL all season. So, pretty solid trade when you look at it in terms of value in that one. But I can't complain. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely. And, a little mention here on the bullpen, right? Just to give some credit. The White Sox in the last month have the 15th ranked ERA in terms of bullpen ERA. So it's, or in terms of team ERA, actually, pardon me. Team ERA is 15th in the last month right now. So it's like, you've got some guys for sure. There's definitely some pieces to keep an eye on. There's some pieces that you have in place. And it's been all right so far. Anybody else in Chicago you want to mention?
No, not really.
Lenyn Sosa has been really good lately.
Yeah.
I'll give him flowers. It's hard to really buy stock into it, considering it's been so up and down for him for 2 years now, and it hasn't been really consistent for a while. But he's had a really good month. We'll see if he can try and earn a bench spot basically going into next season. But yeah, let's. So we're going to talk more Birmingham next week. I want to mention, championship, obviously incredibly exciting for Birmingham. Those guys were fired up. I have never seen a minor league clubhouse look that incredibly pumped and just partying and having a blast. And I was talking with a few guys I know on the team that just seemed like they were thrilled and just loving it, which is awesome to see. And then aside from that, before we dive into Canny, we should mention the Arizona Fall League, because there's, the Arizona Fall League is basically, for those who don't know, is a prospects league, right? It's where prospects go to kind of, ramp up their season. I guess it's building more innings essentially. So it's guys who are able to, get more innings under their belt, and teams send them to the fall league to play in 30-ish games, 25-ish games, 25 games. But, they're huge rosters because one team is comprised of prospects from 5 organizations. So you get kind of a huge roster of guys, get some extra innings, get some more innings for guys who were injured during the season, whatever it is, right? So for the White Sox, they've got, I think is it fair to say the most loaded crop of prospects? I mean, it's definitely up there with almost any other team. I mean, I know the Reds are sending some really good players who are on the White Sox Fall League team as well. But the Glendale Desert Dogs is where the White Sox prospects play, and Colson Montgomery leads the way. It's interesting because Colson got a lot of innings this year and he played a lot of games. That was not an issue of last year. He went to the Fall League because he had a lack of games. This year he goes to the Fall League because they want him to build on what he's doing. Colson Montgomery, we'll talk about it when we break down Charlotte's season in a week or two from now. had a pretty good September, Jeff. He had a pretty good September, and he started to look like he was turning some corners. And I think initially he wasn't on the White Sox fall roster for the Arizona Fall League. And I think when they saw him start to find his rhythm a little more, they were like, we want to let this keep flowing for another month of games. And I think that is why Colson's there, just to keep building on that. And then you've got the second headlining prospect in Grant Taylor, who is there for a very different reason. Grant Taylor is there because he needs to get some innings. Grant Taylor, we saw as just about as good as anybody in terms of minor league pitchers. When he made his 5 starts with Kannapolis, goes down with an injury, has been recovering all season. He probably could have got pushed back at the end of the year, but wasn't necessarily worth it when you can just send him to the Fall League, give him this time to rest, give him this time to build up, and he can get 3-4 starts hopefully in the Fall League where he can really kind of get after it. Beyond those guys, you've got, in terms of pitchers, Eric Adler, who got finished out the AA championship, Andrew Dahlquist, who was big for Birmingham this year, Anthony Hupi Tuanitoa, who was in Birmingham. Not bad, right? I got it down slowly but surely. And then he was in Birmingham most of the year, finished the year in Charlotte. We've got Peyton Pallette, who was a huge piece for Birmingham and completely turned around his outlook this season that we're going to talk about next week for sure. And then in terms of the hitters, Michael Turner, the catcher for the Birmingham Barons, Tim Elko, first baseman in Charlotte this year, Colson Montgomery, and then DJ Gladney, who hit the walk-off to win the championship for Birmingham this year. So a lot of guys from that Birmingham squad, which I love to see, and they're going to keep building off their energy and their flows and everything that's been happening for them. And then plenty of other guys, it's a really fun group, Jeff.
Right. A lot of those guys are in the mix for spots on the roster next year, both some of the relief arms,
definitely,
and guys like Tim Elko.
For sure.
And it's interesting that of all the news the last week or so, with the 2 teams playing for championships, the winding down of the regular season, the news that got me most excited was that Grant Taylor was pitching, because we've seen these guys go down with an injury, like Sean Burke, for example, or Jonathan Stever. They just go down for an injury, and then they're just like gone for like 9-12 months. So the fact that, in fact, his injury was on the minor side is great, and that he's back and healthy enough to pitch in the AZL. It is just phenomenal news.
Yeah, the AFL is going to be a great opportunity for him to really just get after it and just be, see him what he can do and give him some time to build that arm, and then he can go into next year where it's like next year Grant Taylor won't be in Kannapolis, right? Like we know that he will go straight to Winston, could be in Birmingham pretty soon, honestly. And then you've got I'm almost salivating at the idea of a Birmingham rotation that features Noah Schultz, Grant Taylor, and Hagen Smith next year, Jeff, because that would be like, oh man, we got spoiled this year from such a good rotation in Birmingham. That would be another level. I think I would watch every single Birmingham game if those 3 were in the same rotation. I mean, that is just terrifying for AA hitters to have to face those 3 guys in a series potentially. I mean, that's unbelievable to even think about, frankly.
Yeah, and they might turn Noah Schultz loose next year, after having all these 4-inning, 75-pitch starts.
Yeah.
And that'll be something to see. Watch him.
Yeah, this is more stuff we'll talk about next week when we get into Birmingham. But Noah Schultz, 88 innings this year, and then a playoff start as well. So I think he got a total of 92 innings, if my math is right here, including the playoff start. Noah Schultz is going to get, hopefully is going to get in that 130 to 150 innings range next year and be ready to go into 2026 as a big league piece and a fully revved up big league piece. But it's incredible that it's awesome to see that he was able to stay healthy this year and really just keep it rolling because we know how talented this guy is. But let's get to our main kind of segment for today. And then we'll dive into Birmingham next week. We'll dive into Charlotte in a few weeks. We'll dive into Winston's season, and we'll kind of do all these season reviews. But we're going to start with the lowest level because they made a great playoff run, super exciting all year. What was it like, Jeff, first of all, to just be at those Kannapolis playoff games and championship games? Because that was, just watching, I was in Europe for part of it, but watching some of them on my phone and when I was on the Move, and then just, it looked absolutely electric. Well,
the 2 wins that Kannapolis had against Charleston were the 2 most exciting baseball games I watched this year by far. The first game, it's a best of 3. The first game for Kannapolis was on the road in Charleston. And Charleston is a farm team of the Tampa Bay Rays. And there's an edge between the 2 teams. I mean, they play each other really hard and they're really competitive. And they're just something else. It's kind of like, Michigan, Ohio State, Duke, North Carolina. It means a little more to beat each other. And I think Kannapolis went into that series as a decided underdog because the team that had carried them to the championship was the team that was led by Seth Keener, Alex Gordon, Batista,
Yeah.
Bokenshot, like, and all those guys are in Winston-Salem now. So pitching was a big challenge throughout
Yeah.
both playoff series for Kannapolis. They navigated around it. They faced some big time arms in both series, especially in Charleston. I mean, they were loaded with major league pitchers.
Yeah.
That first game was so intense because no one could break away. It was 1-0, 1-1, 2-1, 2-2, 3-2. And then one of the unsung heroes, the guy who exploded in the postseason, was Ryan Burroughs. He hit a
Yeah.
two-run homer, and that was huge, obviously. And it's interesting, I talked to Pat Leland after the end of the season, basically, and I asked him about Ryan, and he said, he's a guy who really likes the spotlight. He's not afraid of it. He relishes it, and seemed
Yeah.
to be the case. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I love all those takeaways. That was a great way to sum it up, kind of, because it is true. The roster turned over so much, and it's hard maintaining redeveloping basically a vibe and an energy and an excitement when you're trying to replace all these players that were your key players essentially, right? Like Aldrin Batista had 17 starts this season, right? Seth Keener had 14 starts. Lucas Gordon had 14 starts. Jake Bockenstad had 15 games, 14 starts, right? Like I'm going through some of these numbers, and these are guys that were key pieces, right? Like even the bullpen, right, had a ton of key pieces that were there that went up throughout the season, right? Obviously Grant Taylor was hurt, and he was amazing for his few starts there, right? There was so many guys to replace, and everybody just stepped up. I mean, Tanner McDougal, right? Like he goes down to, it's a demotion, right? Like that, it feels kind of like a negative thing, but at the same time, it might have been the best thing to happen for him this season because his confidence going into next year is going to be way higher than it was, based on where he was earlier this year. So Kannapolis goes in, they're scrapped. They also add all these draft guys, right? So you're the energy of switching your roster and then having this entire new wave of talent just joining the farm system and getting used to it and finding their settling basically was super exciting. I mean, the whole season there was great, but it's awesome to see beginning of the year, 2023 draft guys develop and grow, and a bunch of them get promoted. And then later in the year, you get the 2024 draft guys. And that's what I love about Single-A baseball. Single-A baseball is the only place you get to see that atmosphere where you have a whole chunk of draft class come and then go. And then the entire next wave of the draft class comes in. At the higher levels, they progress differently, right? Like some guys are going to progress quick, some are going to progress slow, but Single-A, they all start there. And a bunch of them start there at the same time. So it just was super cool to get to see just everything that happened there throughout the season. Let's go through just some of the, let's talk. How about this? Do you want to talk through the championship games, or do you want to talk through players throughout the whole season?
Well, let me run. Look, I kind of wanted to do both.
Yeah.
Because you mentioned Tanner McDougal, and one of the key moment in that game, other than Ryan Burroughs' two-run home run, was I think it was the bottom of the third, and the River Dogs had scored. They had runners on second and third and no outs, and the run they scored put them up by one. And if those other two runs come in, it looks like the game might be close to over. But McDougal stepped up, runners on second and third, no out. He struck out the next three hitters.
Yep.
And it kept him in the game, and I think it proved to be the difference. Now, you're right. A lot of the arms went up, and Pat Leland had to turn to some very different relievers, some very new relievers, but really exciting relievers. And I guess we can start at the top of the list with Aaron Combs, who is a big-time reliever. He was a reliever at the University of Tennessee. He closed out the College World Series, and he played a huge role in the postseason and was unhittable.
Definitely. Yeah, he was exceptional. That's a guy who, I remember when he got assigned to Kannapolis, I was like, okay, this guy's probably going to dominate there, right? Like he's been a dominant pitcher at the SEC level, right? So if you're dominating in an SEC bullpen, you're probably going to handle Single-A pretty well. And he did just that. He was exceptional. He was great. But there's pieces on that whole bullpen, right? Klett Hartzog is a guy that I want to bring up as well in that bullpen, right? Like that's an undrafted free agent who the White Sox brought in.
Also.
Yeah, Nick Pinto, another one, exactly. These are guys they brought in. Nick Pinto, a very late round pick, 19th rounder, right? Clet Hartzog is a a guy who has been, you wanna see what you get from undrafted guys, and you don't necessarily expect them to immediately make an impact, and he did. He was huge for them. It was just up and down the roster, and then you get to that final game, that clinching game, the 11 inning game in that Charleston series, right? This was the divisional series of the Carolina League, right? And Jake Peppers was an absolute gem. Jake Peppers has been, he has had an up and down season. He's definitely shown some things he needs to work on throughout it to grow as a player. But he was one of the few guys that spent the entire season in Kannapolis and just kept coming through. He came through. He really came through in that game through a 5-inning shutout against the River Dogs in that final game, clinching game 3. They go to Clet Hartzog, then they go to Aaron Combs, and then Mark McLaughlin finishes it off. That's a guy who is under the radar, definitely not talked about much by us. But McLaughlin was a draft pick in 2022, has definitely had a lot of ups and downs for sure. He's had a hard time kind of finding his groove, but this season he had a pretty good year out of the bullpen in Kannapolis and has finished out the season strong as well.
Yeah. McLaughlin had 2 innings. He pitched 2 innings in the game that they won in Charleston. And then Pinto, I think, Hartzog had an inning, Pinto had an inning, and Combs closed it out. So a lot of big effort by several arms in the bullpen. And it was funny, after that game, I mean, it was so close, and it looked like Charleston was going to score to tie it up or win it so many times. And I think everyone there was stunned that they lost. They couldn't believe that they actually lost the game. And so, then we moved back to Kannapolis for game 2. And that one was kind of a dud, to be honest. Again, and this is where I think the pitching really caught up with Kannapolis, because you're right. They had Jake Peppers and they had Tanner McDougal. And that was really the only reliable arms. I mean, they had some, and so Pat Leland had to go to some of these young guys, and so
they were needed to get some innings for some of the draft guys. I think part of it, what's tricky about Single-A too, is like you could feel, at least for me, like when I was looking at some stat lines, right, and looking through some stuff, like you could feel that the pitching was like they obviously want to win, but there's also guys you had to get innings, right? Like there's guys that they were trying to get innings for before the season was over. In terms of the young guys, especially with some of the young, college guys, right?
Right.
So, it's going to be interesting. We will see for sure. But I mean, they had to get these guys innings, right? So that game was Mason Moore. It was Carlton Perkins. It was Franklin Arias. Pierce George came in that game, right? So it was a little bit of a scrap together. A lot of the draft guys, some of the recent draft guys, some of last year's draft guys, and Canty still fought in that game. Back in Kannapolis, they still fought through it. I mean, Sam Antonacci has been exceptional. He had 2 hits that game. Walco had 2 hits and a walk that game. They definitely fought. They made it a game for sure. I mean, they had 11 hits that game, even though they only had 4 runs. So definitely made it a game. Ryan Burroughs was great, had 2 doubles that game, right? Like he'd been the whole playoff. So they made it a game, but then they go into game 3 and it's like, oh, this is a tough game. It's definitely going to be difficult. And that was just, like I said earlier with the Peppers, I mentioned it when I was talking a little bit about Peppers game and Hartzog and Combs and McLaughlin and Hartzog, right? It was just great. I mean, that was cinema. Watching back the highlights from that game was so exciting. And I'm sure you loved that one as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Just quickly, you mentioned Ryan Burroughs had 2 doubles in the game 2 that they lost. I mean, those were 2 doubles. I think one of them was off the wall and the other was to the warning track.
Right.
They're really solid. I mean, for the first time this year, I got the feeling every time Ryan came up, he was going to make contact, and that wasn't the case most of the year. So that was good to see. But yeah, I had said that the win in Charleston was the most exciting game I had seen in the season, and it was to that point. But that championship game was so dramatic and so exciting. I mean, it was scoreless for 10 innings. And if you remember, in the minor leagues, you've got the ghost runner starting in the 10th inning. And I think it was the top of the 10th that Charleston had a ghost runner, and he went to third with no outs, and they were able to not let him score. So really exciting game. And the Ballers actually walked it off in the bottom of the 11th, and with a nice double by T.J. McCants. It's just really exciting. And again, Leland turned to those pitchers that he relied on in the win in game one, which was Cleat
Right.
Hartzog for 2 innings, Aaron Combs for 2 hitless innings. Hartzog only gave up 1 hit in his 2 innings. And then Mark McLaughlin, he also pitched 2 innings, only gave up
Right.
1 hit and had 4 strikeouts. So the bullpen comes,
We
it was so
yeah.
exciting, went down to the camera well right by the dugout. So because if they were going to win, it was going to be a walk-off and the place was going to explode, and I wanted to capture it all. So that was
Yeah, of course.
fun to
A
be.
little note on the Aaron Combs outing in that game. You mentioned 2 scoreless innings. He faced 6 batters and struck out 6 batters in that game. That was ridiculous. I was looking at his highlights from that game, and I was like, okay, this guy is just way too good for this level. And it was good hitters too. Like that lineup has Aiden Smith, Emilio Petri. They have some really, really good high end prospects in that lineup, and he just mowed them down, and it was crazy. And then they came through. That walk off obviously was exciting. So Canny, heck of a run in that series. And then they go into the championship, and it's tough. Fredericksburg is a really good team, and they have some players that are really strong. That first game was at home at Kannapolis. Were you at that first game? I can't remember. You were, right?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Yeah,
Oh,
I
wait,
assume so.
let's see. No,
Of the
I missed
Fredericksburg.
it because I had to go to Virginia, but I thought, okay, I'll
Right.
be near Fredericksburg for game 2 and 3.
Right.
One final note, and it's about the first series against the River Dogs, is that Pat Leland's dad and Hall of Famer Jim Leland and his family were in the stands for the game. And the first video I captured when the winning run crossed home plate and the place exploded was Leland runs out where there's a big scrum at second base around TJ McCants. And then I see Pat Leland, and I captured it on film. He's running back across the diamond to behind home plate and waves to his dad and then goes back out to be with the team. And, when I talked to him afterward about how exciting and important it was for his dad to be there, I mean, it was all he could do to contain his emotion. So that was a really nice aspect of the game that, we're happy for Pat. But yeah,
Yeah, that's
the
awesome.
Fredericksburg game one was, I think, 3 days after they wrapped up the series in Kannapolis. They opened the series in Kannapolis, and yeah, it just didn't go. It didn't go well, and the score was close, 6-4, but it never really felt that close. I
Yeah.
just never got the sense that the Ballers were going to come back and win. We did get to see Justin Sinibaldi, a 14th round draft pick this year out of Rutgers, started. But, and Mason Moore out of Kentucky started the game in Kannapolis against the River Dogs. And I'm just not sure it was fair to either of those guys. I mean, you're right. They wanted to get them innings, but, man, to be thrown in the middle of a championship series was tough.
Yeah, it's a tricky spot, especially when you haven't been there all season, right? And these guys are just kind of getting there. These are all guys that threw in college too, right? They threw a lot of college innings. They had a lot of innings under their belt already. It's definitely a tough spot to go into for all those college guys. But at the same time, it's good to see them out there. It's good to see them get some experience in high leverage games, right? So it's tricky. I think there was some level of there maybe could have been better options to throw, but at the same time, it's good to see those guys get some innings, and it's good to see just more continual development from the new draft class guys as well. Going into that second game, what was just the energy, the feeling, just the everything about it? And I mean, that game was a doubleheader, right? So you get rained out on Tuesday, right? And then you get a doubleheader for all the marbles, which is crazy, right? That shouldn't be a thing. That's insane.
Right.
And then Tanner McDougal, whew.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was just so much rain in the area that week. And yeah, Tuesday was rained out, and Wednesday looked like it was going to be rained out, but they were determined to play baseball because the rule was the league ended that day. There were not going to be any more games after that Wednesday. So I don't know if they would have been declared co-champions or Fredericksburg would be declared the championship one, with its one win. But that was going to be it. So the decision was to play 2 7-inning games. And, I talked to Pat afterward, and he said, that actually worked to our advantage. That was 4 innings that we weren't going to have to cover. And I thought, yeah, that's a good point, right? And And so, yeah, Fredericksburg, man, I thought Charleston had a great pitching staff, but Fredericksburg was tough. They started Alex Clemmy in their first game. He was Cleveland's second round draft pick, and the Nats got him in a trade. I think was it Lane Thomas maybe, and he was really tough. But the Ballers got to him for 3 runs,
Yeah.
and including Ryan Burroughs with his third double of the postseason. And you're right, Tanner McDougal was amazing. 1 walk, no hits, 9 strikeouts. And we also saw Aaron Combs come in and lock down the win. He went 2 innings, 1 walk, another strikeout. And so that was exciting. They won the first 7-inning game. They go to the second 7-inning game that night, playing in the rain and with a chance to win the entire championship. But it was going to be a tall order because they were facing the league's pitcher of the year, Travis Sikora, and he looked every bit the part of the pitcher of the year. He was tough. But they hung in there for a
Yeah.
while. They even though they hardly had any hits, they were only down 2-0 for much of the game. And when I was talking to Pat afterward, I said, I just got the feeling that they were never out of it down 2-0. He said, yeah, absolutely. And he said, there was one at bat where Wolkow came up with 2 on, and he hit a fly ball to right field that was caught. And he said, he just missed that pitch. He almost jacked it out of there. But in the bottom of the 6th, again, of a 7-inning game, the Fredericksburg team had a guy on third, and I think there were 2 outs, and there was a ground ball at the middle, and the 2 Kannapolis middle infielders were heading over to make a play, and the ball hits the second base bag and kicks out into left field, and the third run scores. And at that point, they're down 3-0, and you kind of realize, well, the handwriting's on the wall.
Yeah. It's tough,
Really,
right? I mean, it's such an exciting series, and they fought really hard. But it's like Travis Sikora is a top 100 prospect in baseball heading into this season, right? This is not your average single-A pitcher. I know he's a high school guy, right? So it like feels like he's super young, and it's like all these guys are all experienced and they're whatever. But he's a really good prospect, right? Like this is a guy who had a 130 strikeouts and 85 regular season innings, right? Like he's one of the best arms at that level. He's incredibly talented. He's someone who is going to be, a very highly regarded prospect, right? Like that's a tough matchup. And then you go in with Mason Moore, who's like, a college guy, 15th or 14th round pick. It's tough, right? It's a tough matchup. It's not the ideal situation. They fought. They did the best they could. Peppers came in out of the bullpen. It was kind of all hands on deck to try and keep them in that game. The offense just couldn't get the break they needed, unfortunately. So it happens. It's still, regardless, such an incredible run by Canny throughout the season, honestly, and throughout the playoffs.
Yeah, what a great season. And it was a chance for me also just to get a much closer look at a lot of the 2024 draft picks. And now's a good time to start running through guys individually, Elijah, because there were several guys that caught my eye. I mean, we talked about Aaron Combs out of the bullpen, but in the lineup, the guy who really impressed me the most was the catcher, Jackson Appel. He was the 6th-round draft pick, and I think he played 4 years at Penn, and then he went to Texas A&M for his graduate year. And he's not the biggest guy. I mean, I don't think he's as big as either Ronnie Hernandez or Pineda.
Definitely not.
But clearly has a big arm, has the best arm of the 3, and it has a really good approach at the plate. He's left-handed hitter, and I like him a lot. We've been singing the praises of all these minor league catchers for a year now, but man, he's going to move up. He's going to move quick, and he's going to move up to the top of the list quick.
Yeah, he's experienced, right? That's a fifth-year senior draft pick, right? I think Appel is someone who definitely should fly through the system to a degree, right? I think at least the lower levels, I think he's kind of just too good for, honestly. But I do think, it's exciting to think about with him, just the possibilities and where he can go and what he can do for a staff, right? I think that's the biggest thing with him is it's like him managing the pitching staff is going to be excellent moving forward to have a guy with that level of experience behind the plate to help all those young pitchers in Winston and beyond in Birmingham eventually, right? right? That's going to be a catcher that's valuable to have, like in a way when Michael Turner is too, right? Like Michael Turner's value goes beyond what he does at the plate and what he does even on the field, because he is able to really work with these pitchers and really help the young pitchers, right? So it's like it's great. It's exciting stuff. I think it's cool to see kind of the layers of depth on this team. Do you want to go back? I want to go back a little bit and look at some of the guys that were with Kannapolis earlier in the season, because we can't tell the whole story of the season. We talked through the playoffs, really awesome stuff. So a lot of players there at the end of the year that were exciting. But I want to go through some guys that were there, throughout there for the whole season, and some guys that were there earlier in the season and really were some standouts from early in the year. A lot of these 2023 guys. We'll start on the hitting side. The best hitter on this roster when he was there was Ryan Galaney. Ryan Galaney was unbelievable to start the year in Kannapolis, and he definitely slowed down. And we'll talk about him in the Winston recap later on. But when he was in Canny, Jeff, a 346 batting average, he OPS'd over 1,000, 7 home runs in just 30 something games, right? A bunch of doubles, some homers, or some triples, right? I mean, he was just 39 RBIs in 38 games in Single-A is not something you see very often. Ryan Galaney looked like obviously an older guy for the level as a draft guy from last year, but like Galaney was exceptional at the start of the season when Canny got off to a hot start.
Yeah, he played in 38 games and he had a 346 batting average.
Yeah.
He was really tough. And, if you remember who was at the top of the lineup for much of the time Galaney was there was Riku Nishida, who
we will
actually
talk about him for sure.
Yeah, he went to Winston-Salem on July 30th and still ended up leading Kannapolis in hits for the season.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's
every
crazy.
time Galaney came up, Nishida was usually on base. And so, and then some other guys we're going to talk about as well were hitting in front and behind of Galaney, and it was a fun little lineup to go with a great pitching staff.
Yeah, and Nishida, we'll talk about him next week too, because he was a huge part of Birmingham's championship, and that's a guy who, him rising from Canny is what we saw him doing in Canny. I know you were fired up watching him in Canny because it's such a unique profile. He never strikes out, he steals a ton of bases, he walks a ton, gets just great contact skills, and then he makes it all the way to Double-A and is a huge part of that championship team in Birmingham. So we'll talk about him more next week. Caden Connor is another guy from that draft class in 2023 that had a really good start to the season. Caden Connor, a late round draft pick last year, minimal pedigree for sure, but in 78 games in Canny before he went to Winston, 830 OPS, he hit over 300, 24 doubles in 78 games. He was a double machine. Caden Connor just lines the ball all over the field, a pretty good strikeout walk ratio, just a solid hitter overall, and someone who, was a big part of that early lineup as well.
Yeah, well, that's a heck of a nice 1-2 punch, he and Galaney back to back. And then you throw in George Walkow around that. And
I was going to say,
oof.
Yeah, George Walko goes up. I mean, he starts the season in Arizona, and I think even for me, like I've been talking to Walko throughout his coming up, and we've been following him really closely. We love his upside, right? But it's like I didn't really expect him to be in Canny that soon. I think most people expected him to be in Arizona at the Complex League a little bit longer. He just proved that he was too good for the Complex League, and even with the strikeout problems, right? And he goes to Canny, and like it was an up and down season in Canny for sure. Don't get me wrong. I mean, Walko had, when you're striking out 132 times in a minor league season is not ideal, of course. At the same time, he showed a lot of signs of growth. He had 11 home runs. He had a 770 OPS overall. I'm good with a 770 OPS for an 18-year-old playing affiliated ball already. That's pretty exciting.
And those 11 home runs, that's not insignificant because he led the team in home runs, and it's not a league where you see a lot of them. So, he's got to work on hitting the breaking pitches. He's got to lower the strikeout rate, but I'm reasonably confident he will. He's just a kid. He'll figure it out, and when he does, it's a heck of an upside.
Watch out. Yeah, watch out. Seriously, that's exactly right. Ronnie Hernandez is another guy we should mention who was there the whole season, right? Catcher, young guy, only 19. He's super, raw still, definitely as a catcher, as a hitter in general. But this is a guy who, as in his age 19 season, while dealing with catching a frequent amount, he looked pretty solid at times. 715 OPS on the season. More walks than strikeouts. Ronnie has a really good approach and very, very good at watching pitches and being patient and finding his spots, right? 16 doubles, 46 RBIs. The power wasn't where we wanted it to be because I think this is a guy who his calling card is a catcher that should have some pop. He didn't quite get there with the pop, but good plate approach, learning how to catch. Overall, an exciting season moving forward for Ronnie and his development.
Yeah, there's some concerns about his defense. So hopefully, as a young guy, he can. I think that's the biggest thing that could hold him back. I mean, I like the potential of his bat, and you talked about his approach at the plate. This is a guy who played in almost 100 games. He had 62 walks to 59 strikeouts. And that's amazing in low A. So, yeah, I think the bat will play and hopefully the power will come, but I think it's a question of the defense.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that's exactly right. But it'll happen with time, and it's a good developmental season for him as well. I think that's about it. I think we should mention Joral Perez as well. That was a deadline acquisition, right? That was one of the key piece in the Eric Fetty, Michael Kopech deal, right? Joral, since coming to Canny, was pretty solid. There was some ups and downs for sure. I think there's some things you want to see a little bit more of from him. But in general, since joining the organization and since getting traded at the deadline, 775 OPS with Kannapolis, 10 doubles, 2 triples, 2 home runs, some solid 14 walks across those 30 games. Some good things for Perez. He swung and missed a little more than I was expecting for a guy who had a really good approach before he came over the trade. But in general, a pretty solid season for a guy that is now going to be a highly touted prospect in the system, just 19 years old. And I think he could remain in Canny to start the season next year. But I actually think it's probably, considering he had a whole season in Single-A, I'd be pretty ready to see him in Winston, considering he had a pretty good year.
Yeah, he was another guy that I was going to point out. I'm glad you mentioned him. I thought he was the best second base defender I think I saw this year for any of the Sox affiliates. He really looked smooth at second base, and he and Burrows made a nice middle infield combo. And 30 games, he had 14 extra base hits and a 775 OPS. I think the bat's coming along just fine. So I like the trajectory that he's on right now.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree on that front. Flipping over to the pitching side, I think there's a few guys. Obviously, we talked about a lot of these guys already throughout the time. Aldrin Batista was probably the pitcher of the year per se in Canny in terms of, well, I guess there's other guys that actually were just as good, if not better. Lucas Gordon was a stud, but Aldrin Batista is the one guy I want to start with because from a prospect perspective, I do really like Batista. I've been high on him for this entire season. He is great in Canny. He gets up to Winston and is even better. We'll talk about that in a few weeks. But during his time in Canny, Batista was. I kept saying this stuff. He was inconsistent at times, and the command would get a little wavering on him. But generally, the stuff was playing up really well in Kannapolis, and it was exciting to see the way he was pitching. He just attacks the zone. He's not afraid to make pitches he needs to make, just goes at guys, and is someone who I think is going to be, a pretty fun pitcher to keep an eye on and to keep watching. And he'll start in Winston next year and could move from there pretty quickly.
Yeah, and he did, the adjustment to high A wasn't too difficult for him. He had some pretty good games in Winston, and you're right. He's been a guy that you and I have been high on all year, and curious to see what he does in Winston and probably Birmingham as well next year.
Yeah, I think he will get to Birmingham next year, and that Birmingham rotation, like I said earlier, that Birmingham rotation is going to be fun to watch next year, regardless of who's there, because there's a lot of guys that could be there, and it's going to be an absolute blast to watch that Birmingham pitching staff next year. Winston will probably be pretty fun at the beginning of the year as well, so there's a lot of excitement there, a lot to watch. Other pitchers, Lucas Gordon. Lucas Gordon was dominant. This is a guy who pitched at Texas in college, right? He's got a lot of high-level experience, and Gordon, 14 games in Candy before he gets the promotion, a 1.89 ERA. He, is not an overwhelming pitcher, but tons of soft contact. Only 43 hits allowed in 71 innings. Just looked too good for the level and quickly made his way to Winston-Salem midseason.
Elijah, are you concerned at all or surprised at all that some of these guys like Lucas Gordon and Seth Keener struggled a bit in high A?
It's an adjustment, right? Like this is their first professional year. I think it's generally, that's pitching wise, that's a big jump. I think hitting wise, people always say that jumping to double A from high A is the biggest jump. Pitching wise, I think there is a big gap between single A and everything else. I think single A is really just that finding your stuff, figuring out how to throw strikes. Like that is what that is. And then Winston, and when you get to high A, it's like you got to pitch, right? It's not just finding your stuff. It's not just locating. You really got to be pitching. And I am not surprised, to be honest, that some of those guys struggled a little bit. I think, Keener is still adjusting to being a starting pitcher. He had an injury midseason. He only got a few starts in Winston later in the year. And Gordon, I think, the stuff was dominant. Was the stuff he was able to play up in Canny, even though his stuff is not the highest level, right? But he is going to need to adjust now to some higher level hitting. So I'm not surprised, but I do think those guys are going to have strong years next year if they both can start in Winston and keep building on where they left off in Canny.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. couple. Let's see. Who else did you want to cover in Kannapolis? I wanted to circle back to one hitter, and you mentioned his name, and that is the sixth round draft pick, Sam Antonacci.
Fifth round.
He was the other guy, along with Appel, that really caught my eye. He was one of those guys that just great bat to ball skills. Every time you came up, you knew he was going to make contact, and a lot of times good things happened. He really looked impressive.
Yeah, he was exceptional. Antonacci of those draft guys, right? Of the 2024 draft guys that got there in August, right? Like he was the best one of them in terms of at the plate. He was dominant. I mean, this is a guy who was one of the leading hitters, in terms of batting average in all of D1 college baseball last year, right? The JUCO Player of the Year 2 years ago, goes to D1, continues to dominate at D1. Antonacci, someone I'm very high on. I've been excited. He just looked excellent. His at bats were really, really good, and he should definitely start in Winston next year after what we saw from him in Canny. There's no reason to send him back to Canny.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other arms that you want to mention?
I think that's about it. Ricardo Brizuela, we should mention as well. Brizuela is a guy that came up later in the year and made some really solid starts. He looked consistent. He pounds the zone. That's good to see. There was a bunch of bullpen guys, right? But I think we can get into more of those guys next week. In general, though, it was it was a great season. Canny was a fun roster. It was a great season. It was just incredible to watch everything they were able to do throughout the year. The way they were able to adjust when having all of their good guys basically get promoted, and then just recoup more players and just keep it rolling with the next draft class guys. Drew McDaniel, I should mention too. I guess that's another one. I'm looking through some numbers right now. He was only there for a month and a half before he got promoted, but beginning of the season, Drew McDaniel made his first 7 starts of the year in Canny and had a 1.82 ERA across his first 7 starts of the year, 49 strikeouts, only 12 walks. He was dominant. Yeah. Dealt with an injury when he got to Winston. Season got derailed a little bit. So I think it'll be cool for him to kind of have a full year next year to start in Winston and be healthy and all that, because he was really good in Canny when he had the chance. Plenty of other guys that had solid. Manny Velos had a good year out of the bullpen. He was pretty consistent throughout the year for Kannapolis when he was there. Tyler Davis, Carson Jacobs is a guy that we were really excited about. When we were there, we got to see him when he was in Canny, and he immediately goes to Winston and continues to succeed. There was really a lot of pitchers there throughout the season that had good moments, definitely. And I think it was a team effort. I think this when you have in Single-A, and Garrett Wright's another one who was really good when he was there earlier in the year. When you're in Single-A and you have guys coming in and out, like we've talked about so often, you got to just have guys keep stepping up. And that's what happened in Canny. And that's why they were able to go all the way to the championship. And it's really exciting to think about. And next year, it's going to make Winston a pretty fun team to watch.
Yeah, and we'll when we cover Winston-Salem, we'll talk about Carson Jacobs. But he did have a cup of coffee in Kannapolis, and you're right. You and I both got to see him. And after the first game in Charleston, that was so close. He and I swapped messages, and I said, man, I was just praying that you would come out of that bullpen at some point in that game, because he was lights out in his brief stay in Kannapolis.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. But no, it was great. It was a great season overall. Canny it was so fun for me getting to go out there with you this year. I mean, that was really the highlight of my minor league season, was getting to experience Canny and Charlotte as well in person. Super cool. The energy in Kannapolis is great. Shout out to Dan Haloti for another great season out there. That's our guy who does the broadcasting out there, and he was excellent. We'll get him on at some point this offseason to talk a little more for sure. But really, really good season overall in Kannapolis. We will have a full breakdown of the Birmingham Barons AA season next week. Hopefully we're going to be joined by Kurt Bloom, broadcaster in Birmingham. It is going to be, that's going to be fun to talk about, because there is plenty of players in that Birmingham squad that are, very legit pieces, right? So we're excited. This is going to be fun. We're going to bring a ton of offseason content. We're going to go through Birmingham next week. Then we're going to dive into Charlotte and Winston later. And then we'll start getting into some offseason stuff, some prospects, some, reviewing who's on the rise, prospects we think could break out next year. We're going to talk about some predictions. All these different things. It's going to be fun. We're going to have a wonderful offseason. I'm excited to keep talking White Sox, prospects and everything. The White Sox season is wrapping up this weekend. So that'll basically... I know. The next time we talk to you, the White Sox will probably be the worst team of all time. They are still fighting. They keep winning games right now to avoid breaking that record, but going to be hard to sweep Detroit, considering how good Detroit is and how they're in a playoff hunt right now. So we'll see. But we will we'll talk to you once the season's over, and then we will continue to crank out content all offseason. Make sure to check out Jeff at AAA Jeff on X. I am at Elijah EV8, and we will talk to you about the Birmingham Barons Championship next week.
Thanks, nice Jeff. To have you back.
Yeah, it's good to be back. Enjoy your trip.